The midday sun beat down on the ancient cobblestone streets of Windsor, casting long shadows from the tourists who crowded the designated walkways. Among them was Karen Miller, a woman whose name, in this moment, felt less like a given title and more like a prophecy. She was a visitor from Ohio, a regional manager for a mid-sized office supply company, a position she felt entitled her to a certain level of deference from the world. She was a woman accustomed to getting her way, whether it was through a raised voice in a restaurant or a pointedly written email to a customer service department. For Karen, the world was a stage, and she was the star who dictated the cues. Her husband, David, a gentle-natured man who had long ago learned that silence was the easiest path to peace, trailed a few steps behind her, his camera clutched loosely in his hand. Their daughter, Chloe, a thoughtful 16-year-old with earbuds permanently lodged in her ears, walked beside him, and her eyes rolling every time her mother's voice cut through the ambient hum of conversation. Their family holiday in the UK, a trip David had saved for years to afford, was meant to be a cultural immersion, a chance to see history. For Karen, it was another venue to be managed, a series of cues to be circumvented, and experiences to be optimized. The changing of the guard was the day's main event. They had secured a spot along the curb, but Karen deemed it inadequate. As she grumbled about the height of the people in front of her, the angle of the sun, and the general incompetence of the crowd who had, in her mind, deliberately chosen to stand where she wanted to stand. David suggested they move, but the idea of losing their spot, however imperfect, was unacceptable to her. She craned her neck, her irritation growing with every passing minute. The distant sound of brass band music meant to herald a time-honored tradition only served to fray her nerves further. And that's when she saw him, not as a symbol of centuries of tradition, a sentinel performing a duty, but as an obstacle. A member of the Queen's Guard, resplendent in his iconic scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat, was marching with slow, deliberate precision along his post. He was moving towards the metal barrier that separated the public from the hallowed ground. To Karen, this was a power play. She saw the crowd parting, making way for him. And then she saw his path heading directly for the sliver of space she had claimed. In her mind, a transaction was taking place. He was coming to take something from her. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the music and chatter. The guard continued, his gaze fixed ahead, a study in discipline. "You can't just walk through here. We were here first." Her voice rose in pitch, a familiar whine of indignation. People nearby began to turn. Then, sensing the brewing conflict, David tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering, "Karen, just let him through. It's his job." She shook him off with a violent shrug. "His job doesn't give him the right to be rude." The guard was now just feet away, his pace unwavering. The tourists in front of Karen quickly shuffled aside. She stood her ground, arms crossed, a final bastion against this perceived injustice. The guard took another step. It was a moment of pure, unthinking fury. At the frustration of the holiday, the heat, the perceived slights, all culminated in a single, impulsive act. Karen Miller, a middle-aged woman from Ohio, raised her hand and smacked the young guardsman squarely on the shoulder. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was as if she had thrown a rock into a still pond. For a fleeting second, the world held its breath. The guardsman, however, remained a statue, his expression never changing. He took one more step, and pivoted with mechanical precision, and continued his march, the heavy beat of his boots on the cobblestones the only sound. Karen stood there, her hand still partly raised, a flicker of triumph in her eyes that was quickly replaced by confusion. She had expected a reaction, a flinch, a word, an acknowledgement of her power. She got nothing. The silence was far more unnerving than any confrontation could have been. Then the silence broke. It wasn't with the guard's voice, but with the low, deep growl of authority. From the periphery, another guardsman who had been watching the entire scene broke formation. He was a sergeant, identifiable by the insignia on his uniform and the sheer, palpable weight of his presence. He didn't run, but his approach was purposeful, a controlled, swift walk that spoke of immediate action. He stopped directly in front of Karen, who was suddenly very aware of how small she felt in his shadow. The towering bearskin hat seemed to scrape the sky. His face beneath the rim was young, but etched with a sternness that was ancient. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried absolute authority. "You will accompany me immediately." Karen's bravado evaporated in an instant. "Accompany you? For what? I barely touched him. It was nothing." The sergeant's eyes, hard as flint, didn't waver. "Assaulting a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces on duty is a serious offense. You will come with me now, or I will have you escorted by the police." He gestured with a slight nod, and 2 London Metropolitan Police officers who had been managing the crowd materialized by his side. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals, was now a unified audience, their phones held aloft, capturing every moment of Karen's public undoing. David stood frozen, a look of sheer horror on his face. Chloe pulled her earbuds out, her jaw dropping. Karen, her face now a blotchy canvas of red, sputtered, "Hi, this is ridiculous. I'm an American citizen. I have rights." "Ma'am," one of the police officers said calmly, "you are currently in the United Kingdom. Please come with us." The reality of the situation began to crash down on her. There were no customer service managers to appeal to, no corporate policies to weaponize. There was only the immutable law of a foreign land and the consequences of her own actions. The next hour was a blur of humiliation and bureaucratic terror. Karen was led away from the crowd, the sound of their whispers and the clicks of their cameras following her like a shaming drumbeat. She was taken to a small utilitarian office within one of the buildings adjacent to the castle grounds. It smelled of stale coffee and floor polish. The 2 officers sat her down, offered her a glass of water which she refused with a shaky hand, and began the formal process. They asked for her passport, her address, her reason for visiting. Every question felt like an accusation. Her mind raced, trying to find an escape hatch, a loophole. She thought of calling the U.S. Embassy, of demanding a lawyer, of explaining that she was a respected regional manager, and this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the words died in her throat under the calm professional gaze of the officers. They weren't interested in her narrative. They were interested in the facts. A witness had been assaulted. A crime had been committed. And the matter was now out of their hands and would be referred to the Crown Prosecution Service. The word assault echoed in her ears. It was a word from crime dramas, not from her life. It was a word that suddenly, terrifyingly, applied to her. Meanwhile, back on the street, David was in a state of panic. He had tried to follow, but an officer had told him to stay put. He stood helplessly, clutching his camera, the happy holiday memories it contained now feeling like a cruel joke. Chloe stood beside him, not with teenage indifference, but with a strange, quiet calm. "Dad," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "She did it. Everyone saw her. We can't fix this." Her words were a bucket of cold water. He realized with a heavy heart that for the first time in their marriage, his wife's actions had consequences he couldn't smooth over with an apology or a strategic retreat. The hours that followed were agonizing. David made frantic, long-distance calls, canceling their hotel and their onward travel plans. He managed, after several attempts, to get through to the U.S. Embassy's emergency line. The voice on the other end was sympathetic but firm. They could provide a list of local lawyers, They could ensure she was being treated fairly, but they could not intervene in the UK's legal process. Karen Miller was now a subject of British law. Karen was held for several more hours, the reality of a potential charge sinking in. And the initial shock and indignation had worn off, leaving a hollow dread in its place. She was eventually released on police bail, with strict conditions. She had to surrender her passport. She had to appear at a local magistrate's court the following week. The officer handed her a folded piece of paper, her bail sheet, and a card with the contact information for a solicitor David had managed to secure. As she walked out of the police station into the cool English evening, the world looked different. The charming historic buildings now felt like a cage. She was no longer a tourist. She was a defendant. The name on the bail sheet wasn't just her name. It was a case number waiting to be processed. Back at a hastily booked budget hotel on the outskirts of London, the reunion was not one of comfort, but of stark, brutal reality. David sat on the edge of the thin hotel mattress, his head in his hands. Chloe was curled in a chair by the window, yet staring out at the anonymous car park. Karen stood in the center of the room, clutching the bail sheet as if it were a life raft. "They can't do this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was a tap, a little tap on the shoulder. For what? For being in my way? David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. It wasn't about the space, Karen. It was about everything else. It was about you thinking you're above it all. The queue, the crowd, the rules. Him. You thought you were above a British soldier doing his job.